All right, so I'm going to get started. We have a few more people joining us, which is fantastic. My name is Raney Bench. I'm the executive director for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to episode 13 of season 3 of our Chebacco Chats series. These are a series of webinars that we produce each year with authors who contribute to our annual journal, Chebacco. So I'm really excited to be able to welcome our guest tonight, Natalie Springuel. This format that we're using this evening is a webinar format, so you all can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So we would invite you to use the chat or the question and answer buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen to share any comments or questions you have. Please feel free to put those into the chat or the question and answer boxes as the questions come to mind, but I will address them with Natalie at the very end of the episode, and then also give a chance to remind people if you have anything that you want to submit through that, we'll make sure to catch your questions at the end. So we're featuring Natalie's article, NetPen Salmon Farming in Maine, the Historical Perspective, which was published in the 2022 edition of Chebacco, Imagining What If. In the past couple of years, the debate about NetPen salmon farms in Frenchman Bay has really spiked due to the interest of a large aqua farm proposal for these waters. So I was really thrilled when Natalie approached me about creating an article that focused on the history of salmon farming as a way of giving people some historic context for the discussions that are taking place. And because the MDI Historical Society believes that history matters, this seemed like a perfect fit for Chebacco. For more than 2 decades, Natalie has been a Marine Extension Associate with the University of Maine Sea Grant Program based at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor. In previous issues of Chebacco, she's covered the history of MDI's cod fishery, as well as MDI's working waterfront history. She joined the MDI Historical Society Board of Directors in 2001, and we're really excited to have you with us this afternoon, Natalie.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I think we're going to start off with a question that just gets us all kind of on the same page, which is tell us a little bit about wild Atlantic salmon and why people can't fish for them anymore.
Great. Thank you, Rainey. And thanks so much for having me today. It's great. And I love seeing some of the names that I recognize coming on board. There's lots of people who know a lot about salmon in that list. So hopefully my historical perspective is accurate. So yeah, it's great to be here. It was a really fun and interesting and timely article to write and gave me an opportunity to understand the history of the aquaculture industry, particularly salmon, much more than I did before. So a little bit about salmon. Salmon is a diadromous fish, which is one of those species that spends part of their life cycle at sea and part of their life cycle inland in the lakes and rivers and streams of Maine. So they spend the early life part in Maine rivers way up, a lot further up north than we realize. They leave the rivers as smolts and head out to sea, and then they embark on this multi-year journey where they head up north. They turn left and they head north. They go up to Greenland and Labrador into the Labrador Sea, where they mature as adults, and then they work their way back down to Maine rivers when they're ready to spawn. And it's that returning back to Maine rivers which has caused challenges for our salmon in Maine for decades and decades and decades. So to your question of why can't we fish for them anymore, the concerns about the concerns about the salmon population started back as far as the 1800s, which is kind of amazing to think about, sort of environmental decline happening way back then. And so this was especially because of the dams that were built throughout Maine, throughout New England, throughout Atlantic Canada. There are hundreds and hundreds of dams. We think of the big ones, but think about all of the dams that were put into place for, sort of driving the Industrial Revolution. All that impacted the ability of salmon to return to their spawning grounds. And so our declines really, really kicked in early on. So much so that, we had a commercial fishery, we had recreational fishery. You've got some great photos of recreational fishermen. Recreational fishing is definitely, of salmon, is a really big part of our sort of collective memory about salmon, more so than our commercial fishery, I would say, for people alive today, because our commercial fishery closed for salmon in 1949. And then our recreational fishery continued to be very active for several decades until salmon was listed as an endangered species in the year 2000. And so at that point, no more taking of wild salmon out of any body of water in Maine. So that, the Endangered Species Act is a big reason why we're not fishing them anymore. Our hatcheries, basically our hatcheries started a long time ago. Great, you have a Craig Brook hatchery. So let me tell you a little bit about the hatcheries. So the hatcheries were, so a hatchery is a place where you basically grow fish, and then we release them into our rivers and streams. And our hatcheries started in the 1970s. Craig Brook, which is the one in this picture, I think that's roughly in the 1950s, I'm going to guess, but Craig Brook Fish Hatchery started in the late 1880s, early 1890s. As a federal fish hatchery. It's kind of cool. It's in Orland. It's definitely worth checking out. And it's the first federal fish hatchery in the US. And it's still operating today, still producing fish to restock our rivers and streams. And its purpose initially was to try to restock this declining population. So salmon's sort of history is really different than some of the, like cod, right? Which everybody knows that we had a massive commercial fishery for cod up into the 80s or 90s. That salmon has not been that way for a very, very, very long time. And our hatcheries have been an effort to try to bring salmon back. But then it kept declining, and then we put it on the endangered species list. The hatcheries also played a role in the development of the salmon aquaculture industry to bring it to aquaculture. And so essentially, as the as demand, before we closed our fishery, and then we can, the demand for salmon as a food source continued to grow. And our industry, our federal government, our state government, we're all trying to think about how, and our industry, how do we provide salmon to the market that wants to eat salmon. And so there was some experimentation with the hatcheries to actually take the fish that we were growing in the hatcheries and put some of them at sea in net pens to try to help grow a sort of a young aquaculture industry. So some of those fish went to restock the rivers and stream, and some small portion was going in the in the early 80s to some of our very, very, very new salmon farms to try to jumpstart that industry as a way to have a food source for this continually growing market for salmon. And so by the time, that was in the 80s, by the time the Endangered Species Act came around in 2000, our salmon aquaculture industry was already had been going for a couple decades at that time already in Maine.
So you've mentioned a few different terms that I thought it would be helpful and interesting to sort of make sure we understand the differences. So we have a lot of different ways that we rely on marine resources. So there's recreational fishing, which we talked about and sort of understand. But then there's also two different types of fishing, harvesting being one and farming being another. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between harvesting fish and farming fish?
Yeah, so harvesting fish, by some accounts, we could use the term harvesting, whether we're harvesting in the wild or whether we're harvesting from our farm. But I think we're talking about the difference between wild and farming. So wild fisheries, wild harvesting of fish, is what we've been doing as humans for forever, right? So it's the taking of wild species out of the ocean, out of our lakes, out of our rivers, out of our streams for other uses, taking them out of the water. And we use all kinds of different gear for that. We might use hook and line. We might use weir fishing or different types of fish traps. We might spear, we might use nets, we might use bottom trawls, we might use mid-water trawls. There's all gill nets, traps, fixed gear, floating gear, all kinds of different ways that we target fish. And the management of those fisheries, of wild harvest fisheries, are both state and federal. And the regulations are based on things like how much fish can be caught in total. So quotas, how much quota can be allocated to a particular person, limits on gear, limits on numbers of permits that are issued, that kind of thing. Aquaculture, or mariculture, as some people call it, or farming of fish, shellfish, and seaweed is pretty different. I mean, there's similarities in that it's in the ocean and it's seafood ultimately. And so that, there's a lot of similarities in that sense, and some of the same species that we harvest in the wild, we also grow. But farming is when you quite literally grow and husband species from their little tiny stage all the way up to adulthood, or whatever stage that we then pull it out again of the water body for consumption. It's different from a management perspective as well, because you get a permit or a lease for a piece of the ocean where you're going to have your farm. So there's a lot of comparisons between the two with land-based farming. Where you need a place to do it. So one of the big challenges that's a little bit different with, or one of the big sort of things that aquaculture farmers think a lot about, is where do they get their eggs or their seed or their spat to start the farm, as opposed to wild harvest. They're growing in a natural environment. Yeah.
So you've mentioned already a little bit that there's been some attempts related to the technology introduced by hatcheries to have fish farms in this region. But can we talk a little bit more about sort of the history of farming fish, or specifically salmon, for this area?
Yeah. So a little bit of sort of national context. So aquaculture really kind of launched in the US and in Maine in the second half of the 20th century. So after World War II, if you think back to after World War II, the period 20, 30 years after World War II was sort of when our environmental consciousness was coming to the fore. The federal government was passing all kinds of natural resource-based laws and acts. So we passed the National Environmental Policy Act. We passed the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act in that era. We passed the Coastal Zone Management Act. The National Sea Grant Program was created. I work for Maine Sea Grant, so I'm kind of familiar with that one. It was the era of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And so there was a combination of a growing demand for food, a growing global population, but also this desire to kind of right environmental wrongs and to focus on the ocean. We sort of started paying attention to the ocean in a way that, Americans hadn't before. And so there was this sort of effort for research and development on the part of academia and researchers and the federal government and state governments and industry to basically try to kind of jumpstart this ability to grow species at sea. And so in Maine, to bring it kind of home, the first experimentations with finfish. So finfish are like the classic fish, right, that have fins on them, as opposed to shellfish like oysters, clams, etc. So the first efforts at growing finfish in Maine were in the 1970s. And believe it or not, we started with coho salmon, which is a Pacific species, which always blows people away that we brought in non-native species to grow them here. It's sort of contrary to what we think now. We also did some experimentation with rainbow trout. It was all experimental and all, a lot was learned, but they didn't succeed. And then in 1973, that was when Maine, our legislature, kind of launched the modern aquaculture era. You could say that about a few different eras, but we'll say that's the first one, by approving the ability for private entities to lease public waters for private aquaculture operations. So that's when our leasing system started. It's gone through a variety of changes since then, but the fundamental concept is kind of the same. So that was passed by the legislature. And then it took about another decade, but then in the 1980s, as I mentioned earlier, is when salmon started really taking off. And most of the concentration was a little further down east, but there's definitely been a fair bit of activity around MDI. So just to give a couple examples around MDI, one thing that was similar around MDI and Down East is that it started in sort of this homegrown kind of way, where, whether it was fishermen or other entrepreneurs who were, at that time in the early 80s, they were building their salmon pens in the backyard with, whatever they could find. So a totally different thing than we have now, right? So that kind of changed pretty quickly, and it started getting more capitalized and more, more expensive. And on MDI, or in the MDI region, some of the big players that we've had, there was a salmon farm for about 20 years on Swans Island that started in the 1980s. And it was really viewed as a way for the Swans Island economy to diversify. That's definitely that sort of effort to diversify was a big argument for salmon development, especially in the first 20 years, whether it was around MDI or Down East, especially Down East, where, the sardine industry had just collapsed. So there was a need for other economic drivers in a region that didn't have as many, which is a little bit different than MDI, where we have a much more diverse economy. So the one on Swans Island, employed year-round, maybe 8-10 people, and then they had a whole nother crew that was employed during the processing seasons. They had a lot of challenges in the latter years with getting product to market, everything from like being dependent on a ferry schedule, but also pretty quickly sort of global interests started recognizing that Maine was a really interesting place to grow salmon. We have really clean waters, these things that make Maine attractive today to global companies are the same things that made Maine attractive in the 1980s and 90s, and kind of contributed to the consolidation and globalization of our salmon industry. So the company on Swans Island was in fact bought by a Norwegian company in 2000, and then, but it was closed for good in 2003. So that was the end of the Swans Island experiment. There's also been some farming for salmon off of Hardwood Island in the 1990s, and they farmed off of hardwood for about a decade. In the 90s, I worked as a sea kayak guide, and it was always really fun to paddle through the farm. They were always really cool about us paddling through and seeing the fish all over the place. Super interesting. But that one, so they were interested in expanding their operation, including a site off of Long Island. And some folks who are on this Zoom might recall that that was an incredibly controversial proposal, that people were extremely concerned about issues like discharge and other kinds of environmental concerns. Long story short on that one, eventually it didn't pass. And over the course of time, that particular operator switched off of Hardwood Island, and now they're a mussel farmer there. And then to bring it home to Frenchman Bay, we've had some a couple different efforts off of Frenchman Bay. There is the history of the salmon farm that was started off of Preble Island in the 1980s. And at the same time, those folks also started a hatchery at Franklin, in order to sort of become vertically integrated. That effort kind of stalled. And after a few years, the hatchery is now part of the University of Maine Aquaculture Research and Development Enterprise. Preble was also the site of a cod experiment to grow cod, which also lots of learning happened, but it didn't last very long. And now that site is the site of seaweed farming, which is a totally different kind of farming. And then so that's as far as I was able to find in my research, those are the salmon farms that really have sort of tried to make it work around MDI. The industry consolidated in Maine in about 2003, 2004. It was just becoming impossible for the smaller scale operators to make it in the global market. And so bit by bit, the industry consolidated. And now all the salmon farms that we have in Maine are owned by Cook Aquaculture, most of them down east, but there is one salmon farming site off of Black Island, sort of off the southwest waters of MDI. And then the only other thing that I'll say is that it's, I'm just talking about salmon, but Frenchman Bay and the waters around MDI are home to seaweed farms. These waters are home to oyster farms. They're home to mussel farms, and an emerging opportunity in scallop farming is also being experimented in the region.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and you spoke a little bit about the sort of rising environmental consciousness and some of the environmental impacts. What kinds of environmental impacts were uncovered or trying to be resolved during these other experiments of salmon farming? What were the types of environmental concerns that were coming up, and how were they being addressed?
Yeah, so salmon farming, in an established industry kind of way, right? It's been around for not quite 50 years in Maine, and it's gone through all kinds of challenging phases, and is a really different industry today than it was in the 1990s. So over the course of the first 20, 30 years, all kinds of issues were brought to the fore with salmon farming, right? So you hear about diseases like infectious salmon anemia, sea lice has been an issue, predation, seals getting into the farms, that sort of thing, potential escapes, as predation happens or accidents happen and salmon might escape into the water. And then people are concerned about the risk of potentially breeding with wild salmon, of which we have so few, and sort of the dilution of the genetic pool. Oxygen limitations, having to do with, how tightly packed the salmon are in a pen. Warming waters are kind of an interesting one, because historically with salmon farming, one of the challenges that the industry has really experienced in their early stages of growth was a phenomenon known as super chill. So super chill is when the water gets cold enough that the salmon actually develop ice crystals in their flesh. And so, with warming waters, that's becoming less of a concern. But warming waters are a whole other concern in and of themselves, right? So in the late 1990s, I think it was 1998, the industry was actually, members of the industry, certain companies were sued because of issues of disease and violation of the Clean Water Act. And so that really launched this whole new phase of increased attention to the environmental impacts of the potential environmental impacts of salmon farming. And so, the Department of Marine Resources, which is our state management agency, added monitoring programs. The industry developed sort of self-regulating kind of best practices. The Department of Environmental Protection added discharge permitting for salmon farms. So there was a bunch of activity that attempted to look at some of the changes. And so some of the ways, whether that goes far enough or not is not for me to say. There are certainly concerns on all sides of the spectrum on that. A couple of things that have changed, which I think are interesting to pay attention to. One is a requirement that emerged for fallowing farms, so that fallowing, just like it sounds like, you fallow a field, where they have to leave a site to not be farmed for a few years to let it kind of breathe and recoup and flush out while they're farming elsewhere. So that was newly instituted. Things like measuring feed, cameras. So one of the major challenges with salmon farming, which is really different than shellfish and seaweed farming, is that you have to feed salmon. That's a
Rather
major
than just
issue.
getting the nutrients they need out of the water.
Yeah, they're not just eating from what swims by. You have to literally feed them. So you have to, project some pellets into the water column for them to eat. And so we had all kinds of issues with like fouling of the bottom, because they might be getting overfed, or they didn't have ways to measure how much the salmon were actually eating. And then it just adds way too much nutrient into the water. So there's challenges with that they've been attempting to solve. And then a huge issue with salmon farming and any fin fish farming, which again is different than shellfish and seaweed, is waste, right? Salmon poop. And so what do you do with all of that poop? And so that was part of the initiative with fouling, fallowing, leaving farms to fallow. There's probably way more to pay attention to environmentally speaking in farms, but those are some of the big ones that come up a lot when people express concerns about the farms. And whether they go far enough or not in terms of the regulations today, I guess the biggest thing that I will say is that it's a whole lot different than it was in the 1990s.
These conversations are always like brutal how fast they go. So
I
we're down to
know.
about 5 minutes left. But we definitely want to get to some questions, which are already
Yeah.
starting to populate. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or the question and answer box. And as people are doing that, I'll just sort of try to close with one last question from me before I go to our audience. And that is, can you describe where things stand now and how the public can be more effectively engaged in this conversation taking place?
Yeah. So where we stand now, that could go in a lot of different ways, but a couple things that I will say is, so salmon farming is in, we have Cook Aquaculture that is here and has been here for a while, and they're the one company that own all the farms. It's really challenging to establish the importance of their economic impact in Maine, because we have regulations in Maine that limit, if there's less than 3 companies targeting a particular species, then you can't make their numbers public because of confidentiality issues. So we don't have like we can extrapolate how important they are. They're definitely, salmon is an important component of our overall marine resource sector. The one thing that I'll say about American Aquafarms, there are people on this call who have followed American Aquafarms much more closely than I have. But what I will say, because it's commonly misconstrued, is that American Aquafarms, as I'm sure everybody knows, doesn't currently have an active application for their salmon farm. What they're proposing to do is really different than the kinds of salmon farming in the open net pens that I've been talking about. The distinction that I just wanted to clarify in case it's confusing for anyone, they haven't been officially denied, right? So their application was discontinued because it was incomplete, because they weren't able to supply a source for their salmon egg from an approved Maine outfit. And so the Department of Marine Resources discontinued their application. And that's significant because it means that they have not yet been evaluated according to the criteria that the Department of Marine Resources uses to evaluate. And, all assumptions are that they will probably resubmit. They've pretty much said so themselves in some of the webinars that I've attended. And so we'll see what happens with that. But that's a whole, they're going to have to go through the whole process because they haven't been through it yet, which leads us to how can people get engaged? The Department of Marine Resources is really limited by by the criteria by which they evaluate farms, whether they're oyster farms or salmon farms or seaweed farms. There's some slight differences in the evaluation of the farms among the different types, but essentially they're quite limited in the criteria that they can use and when the public can participate we can all express our opinions about a particular farm, but there's only certain times in the process of an application where the department can actually legally consider our input, as in the public. And so paying attention to those particular entry points for the public to have a say, I think is probably the most important thing. And then if people are dissatisfied with the criteria themselves that the Department of Marine Resources uses, then it's just like in whatever year it was, 1973, when the legislature first launched our leases. We have to go back to we have to get the legislature to change the law. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question about where we are now, but
yeah, I mean, as simply as possible, which is not easy, I understand. We're going to get to a few questions that we've got here. One is from John Correa, who says, I understand that hatchery fish do not have the stream fidelity as wild salmon. It's not really a question. I suppose that's a statement. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I'm not entirely sure. I know that there's some experimentation going on now around, so the hatchery fish get released into the rivers, and then they go out to sea. And I know that one of the major problems is before they could even come back and choose which stream to go into, only a little tiny percentage actually come back because there's so much mortality that happens at sea. So that's a huge challenge. And I know that there's some interesting new experimentation happening where some of the hatchery fish are going to be diverted to be grown at Cook Aquaculture farms in the water in order to then kind of build the opportunity to grow a little bit while they're more protected. And then those are going to be distributed into rivers and streams. This is all like totally new and experimental, and I don't know what stage they're at, but it's kind of interesting to think about what that might do in terms of helping the salmon population return to rivers. But the majority of the fish don't make it back from the ocean, which is one of the challenges.
Yeah. Has the state of Maine ever taken the lead in either certifying potential fish farming areas in advance or placing other areas off limits to farming?
That's a good question. Not that I know of. It would be, I'd want to double check with the Department of Marine Resources to make sure I'm not missing anything, but I don't know that I don't think that they have actually said no farming here and yes farming there. I know that there's a lot of research being done around what makes a place an optimal place for a farm from an environmental perspective related to tides and flushing and currents and nutrients and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know that the state has entered the business of actually delineating.
Determining.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I can't guarantee that. I'm not 100% sure.
Why was the salmon farm off Swans Island closed?
My understanding from what I've read, right? So this is just like scouring through the articles that I could find online from the early 2000s, was that the competition with the global markets was too fierce, right? So Norway, Scotland, Chile, countries who have been growing salmon for a long time and are really advanced and are growing a whole lot. Like their industries are quite big compared to ours, Canada. And so it just was really, really difficult for the salmon operation on swans to compete, which is similar to why we've had this consolidation in Maine, because, there were challenges in the courts and other challenges, but really it was difficult for the smaller scale farms to survive against the global market. Like we went from a much smaller, like kind of homegrown kind of industry for a few years, and then quickly, we were noticed by the much larger industrial interests from other countries.
And then unless something else pops up, the last question we have is, are there any salmon farms in the Pacific Northwest? Do they have the same problems as those in Maine? And then there was gratitude and great presentation. That's part of that.
Thank you. Yes, there is some salmon farming in the Northwest. I don't know a lot about it, but Cook Aquaculture has a farm in the Northwest. But I'm kind of talking without a lot of certainty here, but I'm pretty sure that the state of Washington is moving to closing Atlantic salmon farming in the Northwest. I don't know anything about Pacific farming in the Northwest.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, here we go. We have another one. Cook Aquaculture was just kicked out of Washington. There's no other farming in the Northwest. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, that appreciated.
Yeah.
Great. Natalie, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here this evening. We have recorded this and it will go onto our YouTube channel sometime next week. So if you're interested in sharing this, or if you know someone who's missed it, please make sure to let them know that they can always access it through the Mount Desert Island Historical Society's website. Chebacco's Chats is a weekly series. So coming up next week on Thursday, December 8th at 4:30, we will have Tim Garrity, the former executive director here, joined by Renee Duncan from the Maine Coast Heritage Trust to talk about the history and the future of the Stone Barn Farm. So again, thank you so much, Natalie, for your time and for your expertise, and everyone for your questions and your involvement tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.